Good morning and welcome everybody to this panel of CPDP 2023. Today we're going to be talking about cross-border data transfers in Latin America. We're going to be talking about adequacy. We're going to be talking about standard contractual clauses. We're going to be talking about all sorts of other issues related to cross-border data transfers. For those of you who don't know my wonderful panelists, I'll be moderating. My name is Lee Matheson. I am a senior policy counsel for global privacy at the Future of Privacy Forum. Starting us off today is Marcela Matiozzo, who is a partner at VMCA. She specializes in data protection and competition law. She is a visiting fellow at the Yale Information Society Project and a PhD candidate at the University of Sao Paulo. And I think she's going to open our discussion with some perspective on what data transfer issues are most telling in the private sector and from private practice. So, you want to kick it?
Thank you, Lee. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you for the organization of this event, for CPDP Latam hosting us. So I just wanted to give a brief introduction about some of the issues that the private sector is facing when we're looking at cross-border transfers, and with a particular view on Latin America, though, of course, as you know, this is not strictly an issue that is restricted to Latin. And I think that for companies, we could sum up the issues with two words if we want, which are not the greatest words. I'd say we have a relevant level of uncertainty and also a considerably high level of multiplicity. And what do I mean by those two words? So I think we do have a level of uncertainty because in some cases, there are no rules in place, or the rules that we have in place are mostly general orientations that do not answer all of the questions that companies have, and therefore creates room for, problems to arise. And on the side of multiplicity, maybe what we have is different jurisdictions are adopting different models, which is not in itself a problem, but creates, hardship in terms of compliance. If you have to comply with many different rules in many different jurisdictions, and those rules are all different among themselves, then your compliance efforts are much, harder. You just have to devote more time to make sure that you are compliant. So, great. This does not seem like a great place to start, right? So what then? What can we do to, and what has been done to address those issues, especially in Latin America? Well, there's two obvious answers to that question. The first is issue further regulation, right? So if you don't have enough, it came back to life. Okay, good. I won't let go anymore. Yeah, probably. Yeah, connectivity issues. So that's okay. Can you hear me with this one? Okay. So obviously the straightforward solution, which also doesn't say much, is okay, if you don't have enough regulation, then regulate the topic, right? But that speaks as well to the multiplicity issue, which is what regulation are we going in these many jurisdictions? Are we going to actually pass and actually put in place? And does it make sense for that regulation to be concerned with some sort of standardization, right? If we are trying to address the multiplicity issues. And I think it's very important for us to discuss what exactly we mean by standards here. So standards don't at least in my view, they don't necessarily mean that identical rules have to be in place everywhere in order for this problem to be, minimized. But perhaps working with similar concepts and agreeing on methodology would already be a very important and helpful step forward from the perspective. And of course, like I'm speaking from the perspective of the private sector. I think we all have like relevant concerns in terms of like jurisdictions, right? So each jurisdiction is one jurisdiction, and it's completely fine for them to have different views on how data transfers should happen and how they should be regulated, right? And then a brief overview that I think we should undergo in terms of Latin America to more concretely see where we are, and to give some examples as well as of jurisdictions that are in different, let's call it, moments in terms of regulating this issue of data transfers. So I think that, and my regulator is sitting by my side. So here's Lucas, and he will talk more about Brazil, but just a very brief overview of what has happened so far in Brazil, which is a jurisdiction that basically still needs to do a lot of work in terms of regulating, because all we have right now in terms of Brazil for data transfers is what is put forward in the LGPD, right? We don't have yet rules in place other than those. So what happened was that the GPA issued an initial request for comments and subsidies, in Portuguese, tomada de subsídios. And they have stated as well that, that process is underway, but, and Lucas can tell more about that, it has been underway for some time already. And what we have currently in the legislation, more specifically Article 33, is that, there are several scenarios according to which a data transfer can be considered legitimate. From the point of view of the private sector, the ones that are the most relevant are perhaps the fact that the authority can validate regimes in other jurisdictions and consider those regimes to be sufficiently protective. The question here is, fine, how exactly will the GPA carry out this process, right? How will they do that in order to reach that conclusion? That is still an open-ended question. There's the possibility that transfers can take place when standard clauses or so-called MCCs are in place. We also don't have the standard clauses yet. When corporate global clauses are in place, or when certifications or codes of conduct are in place. There are other circumstances in which that can happen, but speaking from the point of view of the private sector, I believe those are the most important ones. So that's the situation in Brazil, right? It's good on the one side because we only have Article 33 in the LGPD, so there's a lot of room to create regulation that is perhaps in line with the idea of standardization. At the same time, companies basically have a lot of questions and not a lot of certainty regarding how to do it now, right? So the rules are not in place. What am I supposed to do now? There are two jurisdictions that I think are interesting as they have taken further steps in that direction and in solving the so-called data transfer issue, which are Uruguay and Argentina. I think both are considered by the European Union to have sufficiently protective systems, which is a step forward in terms of like the volume of data transfers that is going on. Uruguay largely mirrors the GDPR in terms of what the rules in place exactly are. And again, to the issue of the standardization, that can be a relevant point. And it focuses, that is important, on the minimum content of clauses, right? So when I talked about the standard clauses, what Uruguay does is it tries to provide information on what the minimum content of a valid clause would be. Argentina also is very much inspired by the GDPR, with the notable exception of certification, which is something that is, not included in the Argentinian law. And it does also provide draft standard clauses. So the authority does have that provision in which, the draft clauses are here. You can use them, adapt them to your particular scenarios and take that forward. Again, that is really helpful in terms of standardization. And there's one international initiative that is very important in Latin America, though not exclusively in Latin America, which is the Red Iberoamericana de Protección de Dados, which has also been very important in trying to, issue guidelines, especially that contribute to this role of standardization. So in this network, we have Mexico, Colombia, Chile, Argentina, Costa Rica, Peru, Panama, Uruguay, Portugal, and Spain. As I said, not exclusively Latin America, but several Latin American countries. And they have recently issued guidelines which do mirror the standard contractual clauses for the transfer of personal data to third countries, right? So that was, if I'm not mistaken, approved in 2022 in June, July. And it's a good example in which you allow each of these jurisdictions to have their own specific provisions, but what you're trying to do is standardize to some extent so that the private sector has some level playing field and it's easier to adapt according to each specific legislation. So you don't have to do it like all over again if you want to add a jurisdiction to that mix. And just some final words in terms of what I think as a Brazilian in this particular scenario, and considering that Brazil is yet to issue more specific regulation, I think it's interesting to think of cross-border transfers as well in terms of trade, in the sense of how can this facilitate trade, and how can this be a problem and an impediment, if you want to say, to trade? Will that effectively happen? Will that impact relevantly how trade is taking place? I think Sam probably will cover more of that. But in what role does Brazil want to have in that issue, right? So does Brazil want to be a trade leader in Latin America? Maybe the issues regarding data transfers should also be a consideration to be, relevant in this context. It's not solely a data protection issue in that a very technical issue in data protection. It is also, to some extent, connected to trade and other policy considerations that the jurisdictions should have in mind, right? So you want to facilitate trade, maybe you should take that into account when you are creating your regulation. For private companies, this will be very important, but for the overall policy of the jurisdiction, it will also be very important and either helpful or not. So I think we can leave it at that for these very initial comments. Thank you, Lee.
Thank you, Marcela. And that's, I think, a critical reminder for everybody in here, as much as we might love to talk about data protection and data privacy as though they are siloed issues, they do not exist in a vacuum ever, and particularly in the context of international trade issues and commerce. There's a lot of different moving parts. So with that, I'm going to move on to my second panelist, Lucas Borges de Carvalho, who is an advisor to the board of directors of the Brazilian DPA, the ANPD, and he is going to give us, I think, a somewhat exciting preview into some things that the ANPD is working on and will happen shortly, and hopefully maybe answer some of the questions that Marcela posed. So with that, I'll turn it over to Lucas.
Okay, good morning. Thank you for the invitation to be here. Are you listening? Yeah. So I think Marcela's talk was perfect because she introduced the topic, and she mentioned where we are, and I think I will follow her and talk right now about where we are going to. So can you please? First, this is a timeline just to remember where we came from and where we are. I think Marcela made perfect here. And just remember that LGPD was published in 2018, And ANPD was established in 2020. So 2 years and some months from now. And in 2002, as Marcela mentioned, we have this call for contributions on international data transfers. It was the first time that we started at that time the discussions on that topic. It was an open consultation with open questions. Then after that, we started to work with our team there. And then we have first draft in February of this year. And then we have this step of all regulations there. It's our internal consultation. So it's an informal procedure where everyone at the NPG can make comments. And it's very important because it's the first time that's the texts go beyond the team who is directly involved with the regulation. So we got these comments. We review what we have first drafted, and then after that we have our legal team must analyze all regulations. It's a legal obligation that we have. So that legal opinion was ready in June. So again, some other reviews, we change again the draft, and now just a week or two back, the regulation is on the board of directors, which is the last step before the public consultation. Yes, so that's why I put that soon there. I hope, yeah, and I will emphasize the word hope because I cannot be sure. Yes, I will not put some date to my bosses. Yes, you can understand why. And I think in August we'll have the public consultation if everything's come right. Okay.
Can I ask a clarifying question? So just for clarity in the audience, this regulation, is this just the standardized contracts that are contemplated under the LGBT, or is it all of the Article 33 mechanisms that Marcela discussed?
Next slide, please. Yeah. So that's exactly the point of the second slide. So what are we dealing with? Yes. So first, general concept and principles. Yes. Data exporter, data importer. What is international data transfer, and so on. Secondly, adequacy decision. The asterisk there is because we were just discussing if we were gonna include adequacy decisions on this regulation or not. The first idea was to issue a specific regulation about that, but now I think the trend here is to include right now adequacy decision. What's the point to adequacy decision here is to establish the internal procedures that will follow if, for example, ANPG will recognize a country as adequate, or how we will analyze the legal order of a country to decide that it's the level of protection, of data protection that this country is adequate. Yes, so it's really important. Until now, we were as I mentioned, we were thinking about a specific regulation about that, and now we want to accelerate things here, and probably we will deal with it right now. So with this regulation, for example, it will be able to recognize European Union, United States, Argentina, or any country in the world as adequate. Yes, we'll have the criteria and the procedure that we will follow to do this. And last but not least, contractual mechanisms. STC is the most important here. BCRs and specific clauses. This is a specific clause is its own LGPD. I would prefer to call exceptional clauses or very exceptional clauses. That's the definition we are have in the regulation, that has in the regulation, because as we have in standard contractual clauses, we will only use specific clauses for exceptional situations. Personally, I don't like this specific clause, but it's in the law. We need to regulate it, and let's see what will happen. Yeah.
I only have one more follow-up for this slide. The one thing I don't see here is certification mechanisms. Does the ANPD contemplate handling potential recognition of a certification mechanism in a separate regulation? Is that the theory?
Yes, right now we're not dealing with certifications. Yes, it will be on a next step, I think, from no, second moment. Yeah, it's so many things, and we need to go step by step. Yeah, I think the goals and challenges here ensure the same level. I think Marcela mentioned all of this in her talk, and to ensure the same level of protection regardless of where the data is located. This is the main point here. At the same time, we want to make things easier. But from my personal point of view, one thing that you learn when you are writing regulation, and specifically on international data transfer, is that it's not easy to make things easier. Yes, I think that's my main the main thing that I learned participate in this job. And so, but this is a goal, but this is a challenge too, because this is a very technical issue. We are talking about here contracts that will apply to different situations, different contexts, and it's very hard to be frank here to do this. But I think this is one topic that we want to discuss with society in the public consultation. It's easy to say that we need to make things easier, yes, but let's collectively work on make things easier. This is something we want to. And interoperability, I think this is, we are looking to different mechanisms. This the fact that we are dealing here with FCCs, it doesn't mean that we don't like certifications, that we don't like adequacy decisions. It's not the point. We want to use different mechanisms, and also in the sense here that we are also looking at different approach, looking at the EU SCCs, Rede Americana, Ibero-American network clauses too, and trying to incorporate the same concepts. I think this is one thing that we are trying to do. At the same time, we have local laws, and we need to. We cannot just import something that is on European Union, but we need to look at our laws too. So we need to find this balance. And accountability is one, I think, very important principle here. This is in the core, I think, of all the mechanisms of international data transfers. Please. Talking about the SCCs, I anticipate here the general structure, and this is an overview. Okay, as I said, everything can change because you know we are waiting the final decision. But the way we think the SCCs is in these 4 sections. Yes, so we have the first one, general information. It's where you, for lawyers, it's easy to understand. It's the place in the contract where you put the name of the parties, the object of the contract, what is the international, you need to describe the international data transfer you're doing, the kind of data you are processing, and so on. I will bring some more information that's next. And on mandatory clauses, this is, as the name says, it's the part of the contract that you cannot change, yes. And 3 and 4, These are more open sections. Security measures is where the parties will describe the security measures they use regarding, for example, if they are processing sensitive data, they obviously they need different measures than if not dealing with sensitive data. And additional clauses in open, real open section, just to include some clauses, commercial clauses, for example, that the parties want to put in the same contract. Do I have still have time? Yes, very. So I have mentioned here the section on gender information, identification, object, onward transfers. Here is the just to sign if it's to authorize or not authorize the onward transfers, and designated party is to sign responsibilities regarding, for example, transparency, data subject rights, and data breach notifications. So the parties need to appoint which one of them will be responsible for this kind of obligations. So we have only one module of clauses, so that's why that's item 4 is very important here, because you need to sign regarding the situation, the concrete situation that you are dealing with. Last one, I promise. So these are the main topics of the mandatory clauses. I think I will not speak on each one specifically, but you can see these are the main topics that I hope you would expect to be in these sections. In this section: transparency, data subject rights, children sensitive data, data breaches, onward transfers, and government requests. So we have here, in short, we have here what LGPD established on these points. We just incorporate it in the mandatory clauses with some adaptations, of course. But I think that's an overview of what we are doing. So to finish, I just want to call everyone to contribute in our public consultation. It will be in Portuguese, it will be in English too, and hope soon that will happen. And I'm anxious to hear the critics and to receive all the contributions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lucas. And we may have some follow-up questions for you later in this panel. But before we get there, I'm going to turn it over to Sam Schofield, who is the Senior Policy Advisor in the Office of Digital Services within the U.S. Department of Commerce, specifically the International Trade Administration. His portfolio focuses on digital trade, data protection, and AI in Latin America. So I think today he is going to talk to us about a couple of different things, but notably, he's going to discuss the Global CBPR Forum, which is a current a priority of the USDSC. So with that, I'll turn it over to Sam.
Thank you, Lee. Hello. Hello. Okay. You're going to be running the presentation? Okay. Bom dia, buenos dias, good morning, everyone. It's great to be here in Rio for the first time, third time in Brazil, but first time in Rio. So it's really nice to be here. So as Lee mentioned, I'm Sam Schofield. I'm a senior policy advisor at the U.S. Department of Commerce in Washington, D.C. In the Office of Digital Services Industries, where I work on digital trade issues primarily in Latin America, as well as at the OECD. Main issues are data protection, cross-border data flows, and artificial intelligence. So today I'm going to talk about what I think is probably a timely topic given the presentations from Marcela and Lucas. I'm going to be talking about the Global Cross-Border Privacy Rules Forum and associated CBPR certification for companies that addresses some of these issues around how can we leverage data flows for international trade while maintaining rights for consumers around how their data is used across borders. And also it's a mechanism to address the issue of multiplicity, where there are many different laws and regulations emerging around the world. And the position of the US government has always been that this is not a bad thing. It's okay for countries to have different laws. It's a sovereignty issue, and countries should develop the data protection, data privacy laws that they see as best fit for their jurisdiction, but there should also be a broad toolkit available to companies in terms of mechanisms that can be used to bridge gaps between these laws and regulations and facilitate their compliance with what are technically different laws. So I'm going to give sort of a general overview to the about the CBPR forum right now. So what is the cross-border privacy rules system? So this was a concept originally established in APEC, the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, in 2011. There are now 9 countries from APEC that participate in what this is, which is a cooperative enforcement system that sets baseline requirements for companies to use in their associated certification to comply in a baseline form with multiple laws simultaneously. So CBPR is voluntary. It is not a regulation. It is not a law. It is a set of principles and requirements, again, that all participating countries have determined are enforceable under their laws within their jurisdiction. The CBPR fosters enforcement cooperation between the participating countries, the different data protection authorities. So there's a benefit to the regulators. And then there's also a benefit to consumers in that what this certification does is requires companies in each jurisdiction to get certified by an independent certification body, which we call accountability agents. And those agents are responsible for conducting due diligence on companies' privacy practices to make sure that they can adhere to the principles in the CBPR certification. And additionally, those accountability agents, once they certify companies, are responsible for ongoing monitoring of their compliance with the CBPR requirements, and can also provide intake services for complaints that consumers may flag about a company's practices. And they're also intended to augment the work of data privacy authorities in different countries. They do not have any authority or power over the domestic regulators, but they support them in being able to monitor how companies are complying and if companies are doing what they say they're doing within the context of that certification. Next slide. So just very quickly, the CBPR requirements that were developed in APEC were originally intended to implement the 9 APEC privacy framework core principles. So you'll see here on the left, the principles, and then on the right, there are 9 categories of 50 total requirements in the CBPR certification, and those requirements are supposed to be implementing one or more APEC privacy principles. Next slide. So just a snapshot of current participation from within the original APEC CBPR system. There are 9 total jurisdictions: the United States, Mexico, Canada, so all of North America, as well as the Philippines, Chinese Taipei or Taiwan, Australia, Japan, Korea, Singapore, and Australia. And then there are currently about 1,800 entities that are certified with the CBPR across 67 certified multinational companies. And then the accountability agents that I mentioned, we have 9 total accountability agents and 5 of those in the United States. Next slide. And also just very quickly, in terms of US companies participating in the CBPR system, there are currently a total of 46. And it probably unsurprisingly, given that this is a data privacy certification, the majority of those companies that are certified are in the information and communications technology sector, or ICT sector. Next slide. So again, what are the benefits that the CBPR certification provides to different stakeholders? So for companies, it also can help them create a privacy program within their intercorporate structure that may have not existed previously or was not up to international standards. The CBPR program requirements, again, are based on the APEC privacy framework, and the APEC privacy framework is largely based on the OECD privacy principles dating back to 1980. And so ideally, if you're getting the CBPR certification, you're bringing your corporate standards on privacy up to international standards. And then for consumers, it provides more transparency in that a company has to list its information on the CBPR certification website, listing which entities and which countries are tied to that certification and how they handle data. And they also just provide consumers with an additional mechanism to share any complaints about how their data is being used with both an accountability agent and the domestic regulator. And then for regulatory enforcement agencies, the main benefit is that in order for a country to enter the CBPR system or the global CBPR forum, which I'm going to talk about shortly, they first have to agree to participate in a cooperative enforcement arrangement, which we call the CAPE, now under the new system. So that's a body of at least 15 different regulators that are supposed to, under the CBPR system, cooperate in cross-border investigations of data breaches or misuse of data, and also just generally to monitor how companies are complying with the CBPR requirements across all of these countries or jurisdictions. Membership process. So this may change slightly under this new global cross-border privacy rules forum, but generally a regulator in a country will say that they would like to join the CBPR system. The government submits a letter of intent to join the system. And then there is a mapping that is conducted between the applicant country's data privacy laws and the CBPR program requirements, basically to ascertain whether or not that country's laws can enforce all of the CBPR program requirements legally under that system. And then once that is completed, the country, in order for its own companies to start being able to obtain the CBPR certification, the country has to identify an independent accountability agent. That can be a private company, it can be a civil society organization, or it could be a public agency. And that accountability agent then has to be approved by all participating CBPR jurisdictions. Once they're approved, they can begin certifying companies in that new country. So just briefly, the CBPR is recognized in the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, the trilateral trade agreement in North America. It's listed under Chapter 19 on digital trade as a acceptable mechanism to use for data transfers between US, Canada, and Mexico. It's also recognized in the Australia-Singapore Digital Economy Agreement. And then I would just note that while obviously companies have a need to comply with different laws and regulations globally, the most notable regulation is the EU GDPR. And so it's important to note that there is no tension between these two systems from our perspective. There are 3 countries in the CBPR system: Japan, Korea, Canada, and actually now the United States, that have adequacy determinations from the European Commission and also participate in the global CBPR system. They're not intended to be the same thing. They're 2 different approaches that can operate largely in harmony. And then just briefly, I'm not going to go into detail about this because I did not work directly on this project, but as some of you may be aware, just last week, the European Commission finalized its adequacy assessment for the establishment of the new EU-US data privacy framework, which replaces the former Privacy Shield, the arrangement between the US and the European Union for commercial data transfers. So we're very happy that that is in place, and it's also just helpful to be able to have that decision for our trade relationship with the European Union, as well as having the existence of this new global CBPR forum that we're hoping to expand globally as an alternative mechanism available to companies for engaging in responsible cross-border data flows. So just quickly, I'm going to finish with a brief overview of the global CBPR forum. So next slide, please. So last April, the United States and 6 of the APEC CBPR system members announced jointly the establishment of the global CBPR forum, which is what it sounds like is intended to be a global version of the APEC CBPR system in order to make that certification and privacy enforcement arrangement available to countries globally that can meet the standards of the CBPR requirements. I would note that additionally, later in the summer of last year, the 2 other CBPR member jurisdictions also announced that they would be joining this global forum. So we're very pleased to have all 9 current members as part of the new global CBPR forum, and we're talking with upwards of 20 to 25 countries and jurisdictions globally about joining this new arrangement to scale the benefits of the CBPR for consumers, for governments, and for companies. So again, it was announced last April. We are fully operationalizing the CBPR forum by the end of this year, although it is technically available to countries now outside of APEC. So I just want to make that clear that that is an option. but also that the Global CBPR Forum will not have any formal relationship with APEC moving forward. It will be administered independently and separately from APEC. So the name will change and also the association will change. When I said that the Global Forum is currently available for participation by countries outside of APEC, this is an example. So just a couple of weeks ago, the United Kingdom announced that it is joining the Global CBPR Forum as an associate member. And basically what that means is that for a year, they're going to be piloting their participation in the Global CBPR Forum to see how the certification can work under its existing laws and whether it would be beneficial to its companies. So just a general overview of the advocacy efforts here in Latin America, because that's the region that I mainly cover. So to date, we have spoken about the CBPR certification and Global CBPR Forum with approximately 10 countries in Latin America. At the top are the countries with whom we've had the most engagement. We're very pleased at the dialogue that we've had with Brazil over the last 3 years, specifically with the ANPD and several ministries about the benefits of this certification. And this is the third time I've been in Brazil actually to talk about the CBPR and Global CBPR Forum, as well as some meetings that we've had in DC with the ANPD. And then additionally, we've had pretty extensive conversations with Colombia and Costa Rica. And this year, actually dating back to December of 2022, the US Department of Commerce and US Department of State have facilitated about 4 workshops on the Global CBPR Forum with countries in Latin America. So we did one in December in Costa Rica. We were in Mexico in March, although Mexico is already a member of the Global CBPR Forum, but it was intended to sort of strengthen our relationship and implementation of this system. And then we also had workshops here in Brazil in late March, and then recently in Argentina, which was very productive. So I'm going to leave it there just for time, but I just would emphasize again that this is a tool that the United States government is promoting. It is not intended to be the only tool. Many companies will use multiple mechanisms for data transfers in different jurisdictions. But what the CBPR certification is intended to do is, by having more countries in the system that are validating its legitimacy and confirming that CBPR requirements are enforceable in their jurisdiction, what that means for companies is if they have the CBPR certification, they are theoretically in baseline compliance with multiple different laws simultaneously. So if there are unique, let's just say for a quick second that Brazil in the future were a member of the Global CBPR Forum, the LGPD is an independent law. So even if a company had the CBPR certification, if there are additional requirements in Brazil's federal law, they would still be obligated to comply with those requirements. But the idea is that by having with the CBPR certification 75–80% baseline compliance, it allows the company to focus on how do they comply with unique individual requirements in each jurisdiction, but not all requirements, because the CBPR certification implies that they have some compliance already. So again, I'll leave it there, but I'm happy to take questions at the end.
Thank you very much, Sam. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our final panelist, Carolina Rossini, who is the co-founder and director for policy and research at the DataSphere Initiative. She's going to talk about cross-border data transfers in Latin America in the context of the G20, particularly Brazil's forthcoming presidency, I believe, and also has some comments on regulatory sandboxes.
Thank you, Lee. Thank you. I'm going to stand up so we can all see each other better. I actually also want to bring some reflections here, and I would love to hear from the audience on what also is most interest to you guys, right? What are the private sector challenges, as we actually did focus so far, but, and I'm sorry that I'm speaking English even being Brazilian, but there you go. But also I want to bring a whole new sector for us to think about, which is the nonprofit sector and the research sectors, right? Those sectors are crucially also dependent on cross-border data flows, right? So at the data sphere, and just in terms of background, I was here at FGV teaching back in 2005. I teach at Boston University, both in the law school, the data school, and I'm part of various working groups at the World Economic Forum and UN trying to solve these issues, right? And now at the G20 with organizations like ADC and so many others that are here around at CPDP Latam this year. So we are really trying to take some solutions to those forums, but also support, again, research and civil society that also are dealing with that. One of the things you see emerging more and more in the sector to actually counterbalance the power of the private sector are collectives done by individuals, right? More and more individuals are trying to take back the power over their data. And I don't mean value, I don't mean money, I mean access to other forms of benefits, right? The same way we discussed back in the day, access and benefit sharing in biodiversity, the same thing we are discussing now around data. So if you have my data for a health research, I want to also learn about my health. I also when I have access to whatever result you have on your research, even if it's a negative research, or a negative result, right? In terms of like a failure, a drug that failure. But anyway, so these collectives are coming together. And if you check our website back in 2021 and 2022, I did a benchmark mapping over 300 of those organizations across the world. And we just got a grant to actually revamp that. So until the end of the year, you're going to have even more mapping of those organizations. So you're going to see, for example, the collective of the city of Barcelona, right? You're going to see the Earth Biogenome Project, which is the biggest academic research project across the world involving academia from US and Latin America and Europe and China, trying to map genetic material across the world to preserve biodiversity. So it's very interesting. And those folks are taking years and years and years. The Earth Biogenome Project took 5 years to figure out a way to share data. And I'm not even talking just about personal data. I'm also talking about non-personal data, right? So it's very interesting there that the mixture between personal data and non-personal data is making things even more complex nowadays, right? So how do we help those organizations to deal with a patchwork of legislation across the world? So besides privacy law, again, we are important. I've been a human rights advocate forever, but you also have localization legislations across the world, almost 200 last time the OECD mapped, right? So it's a very, very complex environment as our colleagues have dealt. And thankfully, there is more and more transparency on regulation, right? What Lucas mentioned on NADP is an extremely good example. Say, hey, we are organizing our own backyard, right? With the forum now in US and APAC, we are organizing our own backyard to try to help folks make things work. But if you think if you think about civil society organizations, your neighborhood organizations or research organizations, even those efforts are actually really high cost efforts, right? So I'm mentioning this because I want to bring some other tools and solutions that folks are trying to develop exactly to facilitate the life, both of the private sector, but also of anybody, right? One of the things that really worry me on this trend of individuals coming together to form collectives, right? Even if they're intermediary institutions like stewards, is that if you see how many of those are arriving around the world, there are like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, right? So if you have hundreds of collectives, do you think that individually each of those collectives have much power to negotiate with Meta? Probably not, right? So we have to also support those collectives to come together in a massive collective, right? If you think about the union movements, the work movements in the past, right? The number is in forces, right? So how can we create ways for those collectives to also share data, to also to be able to negotiate? Anyway, so I just want to give you context of the complexity, and this complexity that goes beyond the private sector. The tools that are appearing to deal with these issues, besides intermediary institutions, and the UK and the EU have already pushed forward some modules. I would love to learn if Brazil is looking into those intermediary organizations like stewards, are the sandboxes, right? Sandboxes can be operational sandboxes, or regulatory sandboxes. Operational sandboxes is literally a test space for technology. It has been used for many years in telecommunications technology and financial technology, fintech, right? Or where actually, right, we go there, a multi-stakeholder group, and see how a certain technology works. So for example, now, and ANDP is part of that, there is a large push global, worldwide for sandboxes on artificial intelligence, because it's very hard to understand machine learning and artificial intelligence. It's very hard to understand how our algorithm actually is going to work, right? So let's go test, let's go see, and let's go see the effects before that's released into the market, right? To give an example, in the US now, there are some laws coming up in certain states to say that you cannot use data around race to give insurance, right? So to say how much my life insurance costs comparing to Lee, right? They gonna run lots of data, right? Maybe they say, oh no, she's Brazilian, she done samba, she jumps from bridges, she jumps from planes. Her insurance is gonna be more expensive than Lee that stays in DC work. Maybe not, right? I don't know if you jump from planes. But anyway, so sometimes using that race data actually can help, because acknowledge a lot of situations a certain person is in bad. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes it results in prejudice. Sometimes it results in negative effect, like the housing crisis we had in California when race data was used to deny access to housing, right? So let's put that machine learning, that algorithm, etc., in a sandbox and test and see actually what actually happens when we use certain types of data. Okay, the other way to use sandboxes is regulation, right? So now we have all this regulation there. It's really complex, right? Like the fact that the font was so tiny shows how complex in the decks show how complex the things are, because there is a lot we have to understand to make sense of that certain regulation. So let's use a sandbox, again, a testing space, to see how that certain technology will impact. So if we say, don't use race technology in this algorithm, what is the result? Or use, what is the result, right? So you are also actually testing the regulation while moving forward. And I personally think that's important, because a lot of times there is a lot of good intention behind regulation. And again, I'm a lawyer by training, but there are so many chilling effects, right? One of the chilling effects of the GDPR that we all here love is that a lot of small organizations, small startups, small civil society organizations, friends of ours here, were sued in Europe because of the GDPR. Should that be the purpose or the intention of the GDPR? I'm not sure, right? Shouldn't be picking up the big bad guys, or just focusing on the small guys that are trying to send a mailing list around for human rights advocates, right? Anyway, I'm always very worried about the purpose of certain regulations, and if in practice that purpose is being achieved or not. So that's on the sandbox side, and I'm happy to discuss more later. We actually launched a sandboxes project. We launched 2 sandbox projects. We have a report you guys can read online, and we are working very closely with OECD on that. They actually just launched a report on sandboxes for AI, mentioning our report. And we got a large grant from Hewlett Foundation, which is a philanthropy in the US. Many of you have grants from them, to actually test sandboxes in the African continent. The African continent now has a new regional trade agreement, but the countries don't know how to deal with cross-border, right? Even with the trade agreement in place allowing for cross-border. We're gonna test, we just launched like 2 days ago, and we're gonna test in a couple of sectors: sustainability data, digital ID data, financial data, health data, actually in 5, and mobility data. So if you guys are interested in accompanying that, and it's a multi-stakeholder effort, is with the African Union, there's tons of civil society involved, there are tons of academia. It's gonna be very interesting to actually create and implement and test those sandboxes. The other project is the Global Forum on Sandboxes. You guys are all invited to join and observe. So this is the sandbox piece. But another thing that I think we have a very interesting opportunity, especially, well, all of us, right? Because there is a lot of multi-stakeholders in too, is the G20. India is finishing its presidency with the G20 in September. Brazil assumes it's going to be launched in September in Brasilia. There is a intra-ministerial working group already figuring out what Brazil wants to do in the G20. It's going to be interesting to see, and there is a coalition, if anybody's interested, some of you here in the room are part of that, to really push this agenda around privacy, around cross-data flow, that's rights respecting, etc., to be part of the G20. Brazil, I think, historically, has a very good position to push for good things in this sector, right? We had Marco Civil, we had Net Mundial, we had so many good examples that put Brazil in the spotlight as a good example in some of those efforts. So it's going to be very interesting to see how we can support the government through some of these positive agendas to really bring issues of data privacy, cross-border data flow with trust, or like our mission, like how we say, responsibly unlocking the value of data for all, right? So how we can responsibly support cross-border data flow in a way that actually rights respecting, in a way that follows certifications, and so on. Anyway, that is just a call out to say, hey, G20 is going to be here, right? And for those of you who, if you have not worked with G20 before, there are some specific forms to get involved. The G20, which is the government cupola, right? Cupola, is supported by the C20, which is a multi-stakeholder group that has a bunch of working groups. And that C20 is supported by the T20, which is the thinking piece, which all of us can propose papers. Doesn't mean they will be accepted, but we can propose, right? So the idea is propose your papers, advocate for what you need to advocate, because there's going to be a very interesting space to advance those things, both in the G20 and the Mercosur, by the way, which Brazil is actually leading a lot of the digital agenda. So it's a very interesting moment for us Brazilians to, again, putting the mainstream agenda internationally, some of those issues that are so important for us. So keep an eye out. September is the kickoff. And it's very interesting because Brazil is, because of the BRICS even, right? Because of India and South Africa. So India is the current presidency. The next one after Brazil is going to be South Africa. So there is a troika going on. So we don't have only a year or 2 years. We actually have that whole period between India, Brazil, and then South Africa to actually push forward some of these agendas and some form of legal interoperability to allow cross-data flow with trust and respecting sovereign rights and really to responsibly unlock the value of data for all. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Carolina. I know we started a little bit late, so I have a bunch of questions that I can throw at these guys, but just to make sure that the audience is able to participate while we are still on the clock, I'm actually going to open it up now to the floor if we have any questions from the audience in this room for the panelists that are in front of me. Going once. Okay. Oh, wait, I see one. All right. Fly a microphone over to. Oh, is that the one that doesn't work?
It works. Good morning, everyone. My name is Marilia Maciel. I'm from Diplo Foundation, head of digital commerce. So stay in this room for the segue of this discussion. We're going to dive deep into discussions related to data flows and e-commerce. But my question was related to exactly to the economic and development angle of this discussion, because I think we talked about human rights and privacy, which is really important. However, I don't see emerging in discussions from trade agreements or discussions at the WTO at the moment, exceptions when it comes to data flow, or way to encourage data flows to generate development in developing countries. And if we look at the reports that have come up from different UN organizations, the last one from UNCTAD focused on data flows, for instance, we see that data flows are actually generating a lot of concentration in big players, especially US and China. And this is something, of course, we want to push for data flows, but how do we correct the economic imbalances that free data flows are generating as well? Will we just get worse in the future? So if you could perhaps make a comment on this regard, thank you.
Does anyone want to take a first shot at that? Is that?
No, I completely agree, Marilia. And the issue here is exactly that, right? So one of the things that's happening, Europe woke up exactly for that reality, right? Europe saw, because of the services that China and the trade between China and US, there is that concentration and there is market. So I think you see two movements, and I hope Latin America also noticed that and move in that direction. You see India moving forward with the idea of digital public infrastructure, right, which was their main flag in the G20. And that's very interesting because, again, this is totally my take. I don't know if it's correct or not, but that's how I see it. Geopolitically, I see, hey, in the 70s and 80s, India was the place for tercerization, right? That died, right? India lost a lot. By offering digital public infrastructure, they can perhaps bring business back to India and bring data. And for that, they need data flow. And they have been pushing that agenda, right? So that's my conclusion geopolitically that I observe based on what they are moving regulatory. And Europe has the data strategy that they launched a couple of years ago. We actually just launched a report that I co-authored with my RA on that, examining the Europe data strategy with two normatives, with the Data Governance Act and the Data Act and the Data Governance Act. The interesting thing is that they are focusing non-personal data, so they kind of complement the GDPR package. And why? It's about development. It's about bringing back business to Europe. And even them not being expressed about localization, there is a preference for European business to access and to participate on what they are saying are the data lakes, right? So it's all about like, hey, let's help our startups catch up developmentally and in terms of competition by helping them share data. So now Europe is putting together these infrastructures around data lakes for health, for climate. It's really interesting. We've included some, who mentioned that, some exceptions for public interest reasons, right? So in health and climate especially, to really push forward sharing data if there is a public interest reason to that. So let's see what Brazil is gonna push forward, right? It would be interesting because at the end of the day, we forget that there is much more non-personal data than personal data out there, right? And the money is being generated by non-personal data more than personal data. So it's going to be interesting to see, okay, how can we support that? Because again, while the border between person and non-person is getting harder to define, there is still some possibility there to advance from a development perspective.
I'll just comment very quickly. I think this goes back to Lee's point, which is like, we should, of course, there's a technical data protection issue here, a privacy issue here, but this is connected to other policies. And I mean, of course, the ANPD can identify the issue, but it will be important for instance, the Ministry of Industry to think about this policy and be engaged with the discussion so that, for instance, Brazil can decide what it will do. Like, how can I foster data transfers in a way that turns me, Brazil, into a country, that is more connected globally to commerce and so forth. So I think, again, it goes to show that this issue is not solely a data protection issue. It is a human rights issue. It is a commerce issue, and it should be thought of more broadly.
I think that's a huge point to emphasize, and I think it's actually even underlies some of the conflict internationally about what to prioritize in data protection and data privacy. I mean, is the human rights component of data privacy, data protection the most important part? Is it the trade part? Is it encouraging the development of different economies and making sure that there's greater distribution and equity in the world? There's a lot of moving parts. So I'm going to steal I think what will likely be the last question given our time for myself here, because I would like to get the whole panel's take on this and just sort of go down the line. And I think to some extent, when we talk about cross-border data transfers, it's the elephant in the room, and I'm going to make them all say something about it. And it's what is the greatest challenge from all of your perspectives towards creating an effective interoperable standard or a mechanism for cross-border data transfers? Is it the proliferation of bilateral adequacy requirements? Is it different contractual standards? Is it different national laws? Is it different underlying normative frameworks? I think that we see a lot of disagreement internationally on what exactly should be the baseline for this issue. And I'm curious what all four of you on this panel would identify as sort of like the primary sticking point. So I'll just go down the line. I'll start with Sam on my right.
Oh, thanks, Lee. That's a really good question. I mean, I think from my perspective, working for a trade promotion agency, I actually would say the biggest challenge is just that different consumers, different governments, different stakeholders have different expectations around privacy. I think we generally assume that everybody has the same view about how their data should be protected. And while I think there are commonalities and sort of baseline expectations about what can and shouldn't be done with your data, how it should not be exploited, different stakeholders have different sort of expectations in different contexts. And so it's difficult to establish sort of one mechanism as a baseline that addresses all of those concerns. Again, there are different privacy concerns in different contexts, even within how your health data is used. People have different sensitivities about what they're willing to share and how it should be allowed to be used by companies. And so again, I think that goes back to the point that I was making earlier, that the United States believes that there really should be multiple tools available globally that are available to companies and organizations to harness, to demonstrate to consumers transparency about how they're collecting and processing and transferring their data, accountability mechanisms, different accountability mechanisms available under those standard contractual clauses or certifications that allow consumers or governments to take action if they think that companies are not abiding by the standards in those different mechanisms. But I think having a single regulation or a single mechanism as a baseline is probably unlikely, and so that's where the challenge is. It's an opportunity, but it's a challenge in that there are a lot of important and useful mechanisms globally. Adequacy decisions, while the United States, it's very well known, takes issue with some aspects of that approach. There's nothing inherently wrong with it. It's a way of assessing other countries' data protection laws in whether or not they can meet the standards of that domestic country's laws. But the point is that there's benefits and shortcomings to all of the approaches, and we just think that it's important to be able to develop different mechanisms that can be available in different contexts.
Marcelo?
Yeah, I think largely echoing Sam's point, I think I'll try to compare it to what I've seen. So I do both data protection and antitrust, and I saw a convergence movement in antitrust competition law that I think would be relevant to compare here. So this movement towards convergence is something that has been tried in competition law for many, many years. And what we figured out eventually was that it was easier to get convergence if you sliced it up than if you tried to think of like the whole of competition law. So it was easier to find convergence and therefore create rules or standards regarding, for instance, cartels, that cartels are bad and cartels should be fought to some extent. And then we moved on from cartels to procedural rules regarding mergers. And lastly, we try to tackle unilateral conduct, which is much harder, right? And again, to Sam's point, that is because there are different views about like what competition should look like, exactly as there are different views on what like privacy is and what data protection should look like. But maybe focusing on what is more nuclearly convergent and what is easier, instead of trying to come up with a model that addresses all issues and standardizes everything simultaneously, would be more profitable and would actually allow us to move forward more than, only the perfect standard is acceptable. That, I mean, we'll probably not get there, or it will take very long, and then nothing will be done in between. So I think that, as Sam identified, I think the issue is precisely that, and perhaps the way forward would be to, slice it up, try to focus on what we can converge, and, go for that instead of trying to do it all at once.
I totally agree with my colleagues here, Marcela and Sam. I think I'm on the optimistic side of the discussion, as my expectation is not that we are going to build one size fits all and one unique solution, but we have multiple mechanisms. But what I see is that there's a global concern regarding these issues. So we need to, in a pragmatic point of view, need to talk. We need to make some panels like this. And I believe that the convergence here is on the way. And also one important word in this discussion is trust. I believe that if you look at strands 1, strands 2, the point is you cannot focus on only trade, you cannot focus only on economical development issues, and don't look to things that are there. I'm not going to mention here what's the main points on strands 1 and 2. Everybody knows, and I think we are we are growing here. Yes, we are learning. We've mentioned these 2 cases, for example, in the data privacy framework. This is a growing process. We are learning, and I think we are right now in a stage that is different. And as we talked a few days ago, I think the data privacy framework, for example, it's stronger than the last ones. We don't know what will happen. I've been reading Shren's interviews, so he's not super happy as we. I'm not surprised, but I think you need to work a little harder this time. But what I want to mean to emphasize here is that we are strong in the sense that we have more convergence right now. And I mentioned here the EU data privacy framework, US data privacy framework, but I can mention different examples. CBPR, global CBPR, I think this is a step forward, and also the standard contractual clauses and so on. So I'm on the optimistic side, as I said, and I think we will be, at the end, we will have multiple solutions that are interoperable, and this is where we are going, in my point of view.
Thank you so much. And I think just to complement, I agree. I think I hope we are going in the right direction in terms of legal interoperability. I want to also remember that there are very old institutions working on the technical interoperability, and I think they should be at the table, like IEEE and CODATA. IEEE more focused in the US, even being multinational, CODATA in Europe, even being multinational. CODATA has done tons of work here in Brazil. But anyway, but one thing that I think governments must think about, right? It's not just we do it and they will come. Governments have to go out there in the market, in the research sector, in the civil society sector, talk with collectives and say, hey, that's how you're gonna deal with all of this. Some months ago, I was in a panel with the head of compliance for Meta. You know, how big is his team? Do you know how big is his team? 2,500 people. 2,500 people. Do you think USP has 2,500 people to help with compliance with all of this? So how can we help, right? Research enterprises and startups and SMEs, which are the backbones of our economies, to actually deal with all of this? How can we translate all of this to those folks that won't have money to hire 2,500 people for compliance on security and data protection, right? So anyway, that's my message to NDP.
We are, I see a little bit over the end of our panel time here, so I think I'll wrap it up with that. But I want to just extend a huge thank you to my panelists for joining me up here and discussing this issue. I know cross-border data transfers can be dry, but it's also, I think, critically important at this juncture in the world and in data protection and data privacy. So we all are excited, Lucas, to see what happens, and if your reading of the tea leaves is correct with regard to what's new from the ANPD. I think likewise, there's going to be some interesting developments, perhaps, with the new CBPR. So with that, thanks everybody for coming, and thank you so much to my panelists for being up here with me and talking about this today.